Well, this was an opportunity, actually, that Martha Schrader brought to me. She is Congressman Kurt Schrader's wife and former state senator herself, and I serve on the House Veterans Affairs Committee as one of the vice chairs. And so she brought this to me, and Military Child Education Coalition is a group back east, nonprofit, and their goal is to work with states, and actually, sadly, this is one of the last states that they've got funding to do this for. So they've only done this a few times, but their goal is to work with states to bring together policy leaders, local and county governments, people in law enforcement, education, healthcare, folks from the faith-based community, bring them all together, put them in a room, and discuss the issues that are facing military children. And in a state like Oregon, particularly where we have no military installation, no base, this is particularly important as we continue to cycle troops over to the Middle East, Iraq, and Afghanistan. What it means to for children to be living, well, like my children were, in the suburbs while dad is deployed to Iraq or mom is deployed to Afghanistan or parent is gone out of the household. What does that look like, and what does it look like when we have no base, and how can people who are not tied to the military understand what the needs of these children are? And so the engagement really is a two-part. We're doing a dinner. Attorney General Kroger, who's a former Marine himself, will be offering kind of the opening words to the event to kind of get people talking and give them a sense of why we're here. And then on Thursday, we will be doing roundtables, mixing up the tables among different types of leaders and faith-based, and mixing those tables up so that people can engage in some of the things that they have seen in their communities. What are the things that we can be doing, actionable items that at a legislative level, what do we actually need to change in statute to offer support? What are actionable items that, say, a church leader can do? It doesn't take a policy change, but things that they can implement. And really, it's kind of a self-awareness, self-discovery. We're not here to feed anybody the answers of what's right and wrong, because what a military child in my community needs might be different from somebody in Bend or Burns or down at Brookings or places.
So, Julia, let's define the issue here. What are some of the challenges that are affecting kids in the military?
Well, perfect. My husband's a full-time soldier for the Oregon National Guard. We have 3 kids, and these kids are not necessarily tied to other children, so that kind of who are serving, because our soldiers are all over the place. So, when a family member is deployed, spouse is deployed, and there's children in the home, it's a range of things. It's everything from needing somebody to talk to outside of the home who kind of understands the issues. For one of my kids, it was just simply when he needed to leave the classroom and have a meltdown, he needed the understanding from the teacher that that's what he needed to do. And so we worked through those kind of issues as we had them. For some kids, you'll see kind of full-on depression-type symptoms come on, so making sure we have access to things like rural mental health and providers who understand what it means to treat a child for those types of services and have that kind of base core understanding of what's happening when mom or dad's deployed. So it could be anything from healthcare issues to emotional issues to or psychological issues. Even just things like how kids learn that year and what's happening in the classroom. So we'll have educators there as well. So it's challenging. We have a little over 11,000 kids in Oregon who have a either active or veteran parent. And then you've got the issues that could happen post-deployment. So Oregon has had a high instance of military suicide. We've had a high instance of divorce post-deployment. So when you look at those things that affect a child, how do we make sure that even after mom or dad's come home, that we still continue to have mechanisms that touch these children and make sure that there's extra set of eyes and ears watching.
Why do we have the need to have an engagement or a work session to get together and discuss this issue? Is there something that has brought this to the surface to say, there's some issues here we need to at least talk about?
Well, like I said, Oregon has had we've had a lot of deployments. We just brought home last year 3,500 troops, and sometimes we see post-deployment that the needs of those children continues to increase. So there's really no driving factor other than we're just not prepared for, I think, the next time we have a big deployment. I think there's things we can be doing better. Right now, we do have folks who are kind of in and out in small batches, but we are facing at some point down the road another large-scale statewide deployment, probably happen in the next few years. And so this is really about looking at the future with deployments and going, how do we, as a state that doesn't have a base, really think about these things better and be proactive. And Oregon, quite frankly, has done a pretty good job with reintegrating soldiers back into the community, but this is kind of an extension of that, of how do we touch their children and how do we make sure that we've covered our bases for subsequent deployments and for kids who are, parents are currently serving and they might not be deployed, but they just have the additional challenges. I mean, I know that when my husband has drill weekend, my children's teachers know it because the 2 days after drill, my children are kind of a handful at school. So even just those types of things, how do we better communicate with where these children will come into contact with adults, school, healthcare providers?
Let's talk about the dollars and cents of it. Why it's so important to catch kids with maybe they're acting out or maybe they're having some issues that if they're dealt with when they're young, they're much less expensive to deal with it when they're young than have to deal with an adult that has a lifetime or adolescent we're acting out, where if we can get a handle of it when they're a young kid, the state is money ahead.
Well, absolutely. We don't, while we track the adults, we've got mechanisms to track the parents and outcomes with our soldiers. We don't have a very good mechanism right now to track outcomes with kids. So Oregon has a very high youth suicide rate. We don't know if those are kids whose lives have been kind of touched by these deployments over the last 10 years. We've seen that number increase. Those are things we want to look at and track. And how do we catch these kids, before they are struggling in school? Once you got a kid who's a year behind in school, catching him up can take years, and it is resource intensive. And my kids really struggled when Dad was deployed. School was tough. They weren't interested. We're still dealing, a little over a year later, we're still dealing with some of the aftermath of one of my kids who just really struggles with school. We've seen it. So it takes more teacher resource or instructional aid resource. When you've got kids who are, if they're part-time soldiers, potentially they've got health care while they're there. They can come back and not have health care after Dad becomes part-time soldier again, and suddenly you've got some of those needs. If we didn't care for them while they were during deployment, those needs do fall to the state. The Oregon Health Plan, you'll see families who then after they have if Dad's not employed when he comes home from Iraq and loses health insurance, will go to the state health insurance, and the needs for the kids and the families for health care and mental health treatment become very expensive because TRICARE is not picking up the tab anymore. So we want to be preventative. We want to find ways to reach out to these kids and know that there are reassuring adults. And the other thing of it is that we have a lot of adults in the system, educators and priests and folks who are just civilians who also don't understand what they can be doing differently or have a sense of how they can even start for these kids. And so that's really what this engagement's about, is to also get them aware that they play a role in this potentially.
Sure. You mentioned a couple times in the interview just now on one thing that's really caught our attention, and that's the high suicide rate. When you take a look at the Oregon National Guard deployment and the suicide rate in the Oregon Guard, and then you mentioned it also in the teen suicide rate in Oregon, very high as compared to other parts of the country. That's definitely caught our attention, and I'm sure others as well. So your comments on that?
Well, we actually, during our interim legislative days last month, because the legislature's not in session, we actually spent and used half of our interim time for committees in Veterans Affairs, specifically talking about military suicide. And Oregon is ranked, and they're tied for first in non-base states for suicide, and then is like in the top 10 states. And when you think how big like a state like Texas is with military, and then Oregon doesn't have a huge presence, for us to be in the top 10 compared to some of the base states is really quite something. But we are actively rotating troops in and out. Like I said, my husband just came back. We've got folks who've been on, multiple tours. They're on the third, fourth, fifth tour.
Right.
And now imagine what that does for the kid when, mom
So
or
why
dad
do you
is
think
cycling in or out.
why do you think Oregon has such a high suicide rate?
We have good data on that. And one of the things that we are actively trying to figure out is what is driving this. Some of those folks who some of the folks in Oregon who are soldiers who've committed suicide have not had deployment. So you can't quite say, well, because they've been deployed 5 times when they've come back around and had a suicide that was non-deployment related at all. So I don't know if it's economic. We do find that people who try to tap some of the resources, it is finance based. Again, there's the higher divorce rate, so family support structure I think is sometimes stretched thin with our soldiers. So it's a combination of things, and there's really no good one magic bullet answer that says here's why we're having this higher rate of suicide than other parts of the state. So we want to continue to be engaged in that conversation as well, and particularly as it relates to children and looking at some of those soldiers who have committed suicide. They've left behind children.
How does the military suicide rate compared with the populace at large? Are we seeing a higher suicide rate in the military, or is it everyone?
It is Oregon has a higher suicide rate. Oregon, Washington have higher suicide rates than other parts of the country. That could be, people have, I've speculated anything from like seasonal affective disorder to, just the rain, right? But the military does have a higher rate, and it is significant. I don't have an actual statistic for you, but we when we heard that last month, it was a significant increase over the general population.
Enough to catch your attention and say we need to look at this issue.
Absolutely.
Okay. I've heard some people theorize that maybe the suicide rate was higher because, especially in some rural areas of the state, they don't have the access to mental health services and counseling. Do you think that plays a part?
That's another piece of it, too. We tried to put forward some legislation this year around increasing access to rural mental health providers and incentivizing mental health providers who would take TRICARE. Quite frankly, TRICARE is, while I'm grateful to have the insurance, I appreciate the fact that providers take it because they are not reimbursed very well. It is problematic across the nation, not just in Oregon. If we were base communities, a lot of these services would be provided on post. So what we have as a non-base community is that you have to go chase those services from people who are in the community providers, and then they're just not reimbursed very well. So that's problematic too, because then you also have issues with access and who is willing to take these folks on, and then do they have any kind of specialty or broader understanding of this kind of narrow niche of people who, the military is right now 2% of the nation is shouldering the burden of this war. So, it's a small niche compared to the general population.
What do you hope to take away from the meeting?
Well, a couple things. Really, we want to increase the awareness. I mean, that sounds kind of generic, but I think we hear a lot about our soldiers. I think some of the newspapers have done a really good job talking about things like soldiers and, coming home to no jobs or the mental health issues or brain trauma injuries or whatever. But what you really miss is that part about, well, gosh, what about these families who are, struggling as, their soldiers gone to stay behind, keep the house going, and then where do these kids kind of get lost in the shuffle as, say, mom has to take over the other side of the family roles. A lot of times we'll see them mom taking over finances or taking over responsibilities that kind of typically fell to a spouse before. And so that increasing that awareness, and then getting folks to think really about what are the things that they can do in their own communities, because this will be statewide. We'll have people coming from all over the state for this. What are the things that you can be doing in your community to take this information back to your community and say, okay, from a process perspective, our church can do X. And we don't know what X is because we're hoping they kind of come to the conclusion on the second day of the event what those situations and outcomes could be in their community, and what are the things they can do on their own, what are the things they can do without money, from financial support from the state or from the federal government? What are the things that are really good ideas that would need a policy in place that we could bring forward in the subsequent legislative session, and maybe find a way to put some dollars around it that can be rolled out across the state? And where are the pockets of need? I mean, are these issues really hitting kids harder in rural communities that are even more isolated during a deployment? I mean, if you're in the metro area, certainly there's a lot more ways to keep your child entertained and busy for a year while you're waiting for your spouse to come home. But when you're in, the furthest corners of the state, they don't have those same opportunities. So we want to be able to isolate, where some of these problems are, and then really just look for ways to solve them, because every community is going to have their own version of what support for children, deployed parents or veteran parents looks like.
Julia, after you get done with this meeting, we'd like to visit with you and just see what came out of it.
Absolutely.
Okay, anything you'd like to add?
No, I'm looking forward to it. I'm hoping it's going to be a good conversation. I think we've got maybe about 130 people from across the state, leaders in everything from public safety to education to, again, some of our faith-based folks like ecumenical ministries, and there's just a whole bunch of people willing to be involved in the conversation. No matter where you are politically on where why we're sending soldiers over the seas, we're not going to solve that at the state level, but what we can do is find ways to take care of these families and these children, and just the bipartisan spirit of how this came together. I'm really appreciative.